The most dangerous job in Vietnam did not involve flying helicopters into hot landing zones or calling in airstrikes on fortified bunkers. It was simpler than that and far more terrifying. It was being the first man in line, the point man, the soldier who walked ahead of everyone else, stepping into jungle that no friendly boots had touched, searching for an enemy he usually could not see until it was too late. In Vietnam, walking point was a death sentence handed out on rotation, and the men who did it carried the survival of their entire platoon on the soles of their boots. To understand what walking point meant, you need to understand what the jungle did to conventional warfare. Vietnam was not a war of front lines. There were no trenches to hold, no ridge lines to defend in the traditional sense. American infantry operated in small units, usually platoon strength, sometimes just a squad, humping through triple canopy jungle, elephant grass taller than a man, and rice paddies that stretched flat and open with no cover at all. The enemy could be anywhere. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong did not fight the way American soldiers had been trained to expect. They used the terrain itself as a weapon, lacing trails with booby traps, digging spider holes and tunnel complexes, and initiating ambushes at distances so close that the first burst of fire was often decisive. In this kind of war, whoever walked in front died first. The point man's job was deceptively simple on paper. He moved 10 to 20 meters ahead of the main body of the patrol. He set the pace, he chose the path. He scanned the ground for tripwires, pressure plates, and disturbed earth. He watched the tree line for movement. He listened for sounds that did not belong. And he did all of this while carrying a full combat load. 60 to 80 pounds of ammunition, water, rations, grenades, a rifle, and sometimes a machete for hacking through undergrowth, so dense it swallowed light. Private First Class Robert Sampson walked point for Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, operating out of Landing Zone X-Ray in the Central Highlands during 1966. Sampson was 19 years old. He had been in country for 3 months when his platoon sergeant told him he was on point for the next patrol into the Ia Drang Valley. The Ia Drang had already earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous pieces of ground in all of South Vietnam. Dense jungle, broken terrain, and a heavy NVA presence made every step a gamble. Sampson later said the worst part was not the fear of being shot, it was the fear of the thing he could not see. The mine, the tripwire, the punji stake pit, covered with leaves. He said he spent so much time staring at the ground 2 feet in front of his boots that he sometimes forgot to look up, and that forgetting could get you killed just as fast. On a typical patrol, the point man moved out first, followed by the slack man, who walked 5 to 10 meters behind and slightly offset, covering the angles the point man could not watch. Behind the slack man came the platoon leader or the radio operator, then the rest of the column stretching back in a file that could run 50 meters or more through the bush. The point man's relationship with his slack man was the most critical partnership in the platoon. A good slack man watched everything the point man missed. He read the point man's body language, knew when to freeze, when to drop, when to fire without waiting for an order. Specialist 4th Class Danny Reyes served as a slack man with the 25th Infantry Division near Cu Chi in 1968. Cu Chi sat on top of one of the most elaborate tunnel complexes the Viet Cong ever built, and patrols in that area walked over enemy positions without knowing it. Reyes described it as walking on a carpet with a man underneath it, holding a knife. He could feel the danger through the ground, he said, but he could never pin it down. The rotation for walking point varied from unit to unit. In some platoons, it rotated daily. In others, the platoon sergeant assigned it based on experience or simply picked whoever he thought could handle the pressure that day. There were units where the point position effectively became permanent for certain soldiers. Men who had a talent for reading the jungle, for sensing what was wrong before they could explain why. These soldiers developed an almost supernatural ability to detect booby traps and ambushes. They noticed bent grass. They caught the faint metallic smell of a freshly laid mine. They registered the silence of birds that should have been calling. Some of them described it as a feeling in the stomach, a tightening that told them to stop moving before their conscious mind had processed what was wrong. Sergeant First Class Frederick Williams served with the 173rd Airborne Brigade in the Central Highlands during 1967 and 1968. Williams walked point more times than he could count. He operated in some of the most heavily booby-trapped terrain in the country, particularly in the jungle surrounding Dak 2, where the NVA had fortified ridgelines with bunker complexes and seeded the approach routes with mines and tripwires. Williams developed what his men called the freeze. He would stop dead in mid-step, sometimes with one foot in the air, and the entire column behind him would halt instantly. More often than not, there was something there. A wire strung across the trail at ankle height, a pressure plate buried under a thin layer of dirt, a grenade rigged to a stake with the pin half pulled. His platoon leader said Williams saved more lives with his feet than most soldiers saved with their rifles. The physical toll of walking point was staggering. The mental toll was worse. Point men in Vietnam experienced a kind of sustained hypervigilance that modern psychology would recognize as a recipe for post-traumatic stress. Every step carried the possibility of instant death or catastrophic injury. There was no way to relax, no way to let the mind wander, no moment when the threat decreased. And the threat was not abstract. These men saw what happened when someone missed a tripwire. They saw what a command-detonated mine did to the human body. They saw their friends step on a pressure plate and disappear from the waist down. This was not something they heard about. They were standing 10 meters away when it happened. The booby traps in Vietnam were extraordinarily varied and viciously effective. The Viet Cong used everything from simple punji stake pits, sharpened bamboo stakes, smeared with human waste and concealed under a thin covering of vegetation, to complex mechanical devices built from unexploded American ordnance. A dud 500-pound bomb could be rigged with a pressure detonator and buried in a trail. Mortar rounds and artillery shells were wired into command-detonated mines triggered from concealed positions. Grenades were attached to tripwires and hidden in vegetation along likely patrol routes. The Bouncing Betty anti-personnel mine, properly the M16 mine, was particularly feared. When triggered, it launched a charge to waist height before detonating, sending shrapnel through the midsection of anyone within range. The point man was almost always the one who found these devices, either by spotting them or by stepping on them. By mid-1967, booby traps and mines accounted for a significant percentage of American casualties in Vietnam. In some areas of operation, particularly in the southern provinces and the areas around the demilitarized zone, mines and booby traps caused more casualties than direct enemy fire. The 3rd Marine Division operating near the DMZ reported that in certain months over 40% of their wounded were victims of mines and booby traps rather than bullets or shrapnel from conventional weapons. This meant that walking point was not just dangerous in the way that combat is dangerous. It was dangerous in the way that walking through a minefield is dangerous, a slow, grinding daily lottery where the odds caught up with everyone eventually. The equipment carried by point men evolved throughout the war. Early in the conflict, point men typically carried the standard M14 rifle. As the war progressed and the M16 became standard issue, point men often preferred it for its lighter weight and higher rate of fire, despite the weapon's early reputation for jamming in the wet conditions of the Vietnamese jungle. Some point men carried shotguns, particularly the Ithaca Model 37 or the Remington 870, weapons that were devastating at close range and ideal for the kind of sudden, point-blank engagements that ambushes produced. Others carried the KR-15, the shortened carbine version of the M16, which was easier to maneuver through dense vegetation. In addition to their primary weapon, point men typically carried extra fragmentation grenades, smoke grenades for marking positions, and sometimes a claymore mine that could be quickly deployed if the patrol needed to break contact. Specialist 4th Class Michael Torres walked point for a long-range reconnaissance patrol, commonly called a LRP team, attached to the 101st Airborne Division operating in the A Shau Valley during 1969. The A Shau Valley was one of the most contested pieces of terrain in the entire war, a narrow corridor running along the Laotian border that served as a major artery for the Ho Chi Minh Trail. NVA units moved through the valley in regimental strength, and the jungle was so thick that air support was often useless. Torres operated in 4-man and 6-man LRP teams that, inserted by helicopter, patrolled for 3 to 5 days and extracted, assuming they survived long enough to call for a pickup. Walking point on a LRP mission was a different kind of fear than walking point on a conventional patrol. There was no platoon behind you, no company to call for reinforcement. If your team made contact, you were outnumbered by definition, and your survival depended entirely on stealth and speed. Torres said the Aisha was the quietest and loudest place he had ever been. Quiet because the jungle absorbed every sound, loud because his own heartbeat was deafening. LERP teams used specialized navigation techniques that put even more pressure on the point man. Without the noise discipline of a larger unit to mask their movement, every snapped twig and rustled leaf was a potential death sentence. Torres carried a sword-down compass taped to his wrist so he could check direction without stopping, and he memorized terrain features from aerial photographs before every insertion, so he could navigate without consulting a map. His boots were standard jungle boots, but he had cut the steel shanks out of the soles because he believed he could feel the ground better without them, that the slight give of the sole against a buried wire or a pressure plate might give him the fraction of a second he needed to stop. On March 18, 1969, Torres and his team inserted into the valley floor near the abandoned Special Forces camp at Eluwe. Eluwe had been overrun during the Tet Offensive the previous year, and the surrounding jungle had been reclaimed by NVA forces who used the old camp as a waypoint. Torres was on point, moving through bamboo so thick he had to turn sideways to pass through it. 50 meters off the insertion point, he smelled wood smoke. He raised his fist and the team froze. Through the bamboo, he could see the edge of a base camp, cooking fires, equipment stacked under tarps, soldiers moving between structures built from logs and earth. Torres counted over 30 NVA soldiers in his field of vision and knew there were likely hundreds more beyond what he could see. His team was 70 meters from an enemy battalion. He turned, made eye contact with his team leader, and began the slowest, most careful withdrawal of his life. They moved backward the way they had come, stepping in their own boot prints for over an hour. They called for extraction from a secondary landing zone 2 kilometers east and were pulled out under fire when an NVA patrol stumbled onto their trail. The psychological burden of Walking Point extended far beyond the mission itself. Point men who survived their tours often found that the hyper-vigilance they had developed in the jungle followed them home. They could not walk down a sidewalk without scanning for threats. They could not enter a room without cataloging the exits. The habits that kept them alive in Vietnam became prisons in peacetime. Many of them described feeling more alive on point than they ever felt before or after, a terrible admission that the closest they came to feeling fully present was when they were closest to dying. The units that operated most frequently in point-heavy environments developed their own cultures and rituals around the position. In the 1st Cavalry Division during the Central Highlands campaigns of 1965 and 1966, point men were given first choice of rations and first access to water resupply. In the 4th Infantry Division near Pleiku, some platoons rotated the point position every 2 hours during long patrols to prevent the mental fatigue that led to mistakes. In Marine units operating near the DMZ and in Quang Tri Province, there were point men who became legendary within their battalions. Soldiers whose names were spoken with a kind of reverence that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the fact that they had kept other men alive by being willing to die first. Corporal James Wilder served as a point man with the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, a unit that earned the grim nickname The Walking Dead for its extraordinarily high casualty rate. The 1st Battalion, 9th Marines operated in some of the most heavily contested terrain near the DMZ throughout 1967 and into 1968, conducting patrols through areas where NVA ambushes were so frequent that contact was expected on nearly every mission. Wilder walked point for his squad through the rolling hills and dense scrub south of Con Tien, a Marine combat base that endured some of the heaviest sustained bombardment of the entire war. He was wounded twice by booby traps and returned to point both times after recovery. When asked why he went back, he said someone had to do it, and he would rather it be someone who knew what he was doing. The Battle of Dak Tu in November 1967 illustrated the stakes of Walking Point in the most brutal terms. The 173rd Airborne Brigade was ordered to assault Hill 875, a heavily fortified NVA position southwest of Dak Tu in Kontum Province. The approach to the hill was through dense jungle that had been seeded with mines and covered by interlocking fields of fire from bunkers dug into the hillside. On November 19, 1967, companies of the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, began their assault up the slopes. The point elements of the lead platoons walked directly into a killing zone. The NVA opened fire from concealed bunkers at ranges as close as 15 meters. The point men and their slack men were killed or wounded in the first seconds of the engagement. The companies were pinned against the hillside, unable to advance or retreat, taking fire from 3 sides. An errant bomb from a friendly airstrike landed on the battalion's aid station, killing or wounding dozens of men who had already been hit. The fighting on Hill 875 lasted 4 days. Resupply was impossible for the first 48 hours. The wounded lay in the open while medics worked under fire with dwindling supplies. Water ran out, ammunition ran low. Soldiers stripped magazines from the dead to keep firing. When the hill was finally taken on November 23rd, the NVA had withdrawn during the night, leaving behind a landscape of shattered trees, collapsed bunkers, and American dead. The battle cost the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, over 80% casualties. Many of the men who died first were the point men and their slack men, the soldiers who walked into the kill zone before anyone knew it was there. The numbers told a story that no amount of official optimism could obscure. Between 1965 and 1972, over 11,000 Americans were killed by mines and booby traps in Vietnam. Tens of thousands more were wounded, many of them catastrophically, losing limbs, eyes, and futures in a single step. The soldiers who walked point absorbed a disproportionate share of these casualties. They were the ones who found the mines. They were the ones who tripped the wires. They were the ones who took the first rounds of an ambush. And they did it knowing, with absolute clarity, that the odds were not in their favor. There is no medal specifically for walking point. There is no special designation, no badge, no ribbon that says this man walked first. The point men of Vietnam came home carrying the same decorations as everyone else, and in many cases fewer, because the kind of heroism required to walk point was not the kind that produced dramatic acts witnessed by officers writing commendations. It was a slow, quiet, grinding courage, the courage to put one foot in front of the other into ground that might kill you, and to do it again the next day and the day after that. Sergeant Williams, the man with the frieze, put it simply. He said every man in the platoon was brave, but the man on point was brave first. He was brave before anyone else had to be, and he was brave alone.